call of the bugle is back. China is reviving the military tradition in barracks across the country. But why? And what new tunes can we expect? And China plans to turn its armed forces into a world-class military by the mid-21st century. How is China's vision taking shape amid new tensions in a rapidly changing world? Welcome to The Point. From Beijing, I'm Li Xin. The Chinese military is restoring the daily bugle calls scheduled to start on October the 1st, which is also China's 69th National Day. The bugle calls tradition was established in the early days of the Chinese People's Liberation Army and played an important role in boosting the morale of soldiers in the battlefields. But the practice fell out of fashion in the 1980s as the army started to modernize itself. However, the familiar melodies of the bugle are to ring again in military barracks nationwide this October. And a set of 21 new tunes are to be introduced starting next August. What are the considerations behind the reintroduction of this tradition? Joining me for the discussion in the studio are Victor Gao, Vice President at the Center for China and Globalization, and Einar Tangen, Current Affairs commentator. Before we start the discussion, let's listen to some traditional bugle calls to refresh our memories. So, just to give us an idea of what bugle calls are like, and as I mentioned, gentlemen, bugle calls are used normally to boost soldiers' morale in the battlefield. But how did this tradition start in the first place, Victor Gao?
Well, at least in the tradition of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, bugle calls served a very important purpose. In the 1920s, all the way till, let's say, the Korean War, the Chinese border clash with Vietnam, for example, bugle calls played a very important role in combative assignments as well as non-combative assignments, and became such a strong fingerprint of military life, not only for soldiers and officers in the barracks, for example, whenever they are on the road marching from one place to another, but also more importantly in combat situations. So that's the Chinese tradition. And I think it had a reason, because in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, for example, there was no decent telecommunication between different units, and bugles actually probably were the most effective way of communicating between the different units and also rallying the morale of the soldiers to the specifically designed tasks that they are supposed to perform. But as you just now mentioned, with the modernization of the military, with the popularization of telecommunication devices, bugles fell out of fashion for quite a few years.
In the beginning, Einar, tell us a bit about the history of such a tradition. Was it a Chinese thing? Was it imported, to your knowledge?
Well, it goes back quite a ways. I mean, the Romans started using it in the 4th century, and it became kind of the norm, especially in Western battles and things like that. And it's a way of directing communications on the battlefield, because you have to do it. The generals would get up on a hill, they had to send orders out, but there had to be some way of getting people to advance, to go right, to go left, and things like this. So you had to know when to start the battle. And this is when you had large formations and things like that. Actually, in Asia, they generally tended to use banners. They would use a flag system and a banner system that soldiers could see. So the banners would be up on the hills, and the soldiers could look and see what they were supposed to do.
Yeah.
They did use some musical instruments, but once again, it was about battlefield communications.
Right.
But once you start using guns, all right, the idea of using a banner does not make sense, because somebody would shoot them.
Okay, so Victor, explain to us, why does China want to reintroduce this traditional practice at such a moment?
Well, before I answer your question, in very ancient time, Chinese military used a lot of drums, I would say, and they served a very important purpose of communicating orders back and forth.
Also smoke.
Smoke, yes, smoke along the Great Wall.
Yeah.
However, bugle, being very small, very light to carry, is much more convenient to use than big drums, for example, which need to be carried by several people at least. Now restoring the bugle, in my best judgment, I think it really is a restoration of an important part of the military tradition in China. It's very popular among soldiers and officers in the ranks and file in the military. Secondly, I personally believe bugle calls can really rally the morale of the soldiers in peacetime as well as in possibly wartime, because it's part of the tradition. It really rallies the people's morale to rally the people behind the banner, and they clearly set out the specific tasks that you are supposed to do, either getting up, going to drills, marching, for example, or going to perform different kinds of combative missions.
I don't think there's one to march. But when you ask that question, it's very simple. The U.S. started doing the same thing, and then they noticed that on the bases they wanted to have these because the bugle is really the clock of the military. I mean, it tells you when to get up, reveille. It tells you when lights are out and then final lights out and things like that.
Can't people use clocks or any other way of signaling things?
But if people are marching, things like that, literally they have rules for people on the post and people who are associated, the families. So when the call has come, when they're doing the reveille and they're raising the flag, you're supposed to stand, all right? Put your hand on your heart, face the flag, all right, and do this. And this kind of collective activity, very important to the military, because they have to be reminded every day, why am I sacrificing? Why am I training? What is this all about? And it's about country.
Is it also kind of ceremonial as well, put a greater emphasis on the meaning of life in the military barracks?
Absolutely.
But can we say that since China abandoned or suspended this tradition in the 1980s, was there some kind of deterioration in terms of morale among the Chinese soldiers that at this particular moment we decide to change, to turn things around?
I think over the past 6 years or so, under President Xi Jinping, who also is the chairman of the Central Military Commission in China, there is a great effort of modernizing the army and also improving the combativeness or combat readiness of the army. And I think restoring the bugles in the military serves that purpose. That is, people in the army, ranks and file, officers and soldiers, are reminded again and again in a unified way, in a very collective way, what's the mission they are supposed to do in peacetime as well as in possibly combative situations. I personally believe this is a good thing to do. Where I live, I can actually pick up the bugle call early in the morning or early in the evening, most likely for getting up from bed and going to dinner time, because I live in a place very close to the military
So
barracks.
that also gives you a sense of routine and...
Exactly. Even for a civilian like me, whenever I pick up the bugle calls, I know the military is being prepared. They are ready for their mission.
Okay, I know what you're saying.
Yeah, but there's another part to this. I mean, when she came in, there was a huge reassignment of the military. They got rid of the normal regiments and armies that had been back there, because they had become kind of fiefdoms. And what he said is, no, we have an army, and the army is loyal to China and to the leadership. So he kind of deconstructed things a little bit, but I think they're bringing it back. It's a very comforting way of knowing that you're military. And it's not just the military people, it's also their families. As you said, this is the clock that regulates life on an army base and even on the military. The problem, though, is it's only 5 notes. All right, there are only 21 of these tunes. Yeah. But actually blowing a bugle correctly is very, very difficult because there are no keys. You don't blow in, you know, like a trumpet.
Training. Yeah.
You have to be very well. So they're going to have a need for a lot of buglers.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, starting this October, we'll reintroduce the existing tones which have been used in the past, but starting next August we're going to have a set of 21 new tunes, and I was told that the new tunes will include routine calls, action calls and ceremonial calls, and the new routine bugle calls would include 11 items, namely réveille, which is getting out of bed, then drill, recall, mess, school call, recap, nap, after nap, retreat, tabs, and tattoo. I don't know whether you know the meaning of what is tattoo, for instance.
I do know tattoo.
Yeah, tattoo is time to go to bed.
Yes.
Yeah. So what is the difference? Why do you need new tunes here? What do you think, Einar?
Well, I don't think you need new tunes, but I mean it's just the military's way of differentiating itself. In a Western base in the U.S., it would be 7 calls during a normal workday. We're not including military, just the normal ones. And I think this is just part of the differences of things. I mean, every army, every civilization has always had something that's a little bit different. No one exactly copies the other. They always think there's a way of improving it. And with 11, obviously there are more calls.
Okay, Victor.
Well, the tones you are referring to just now, in my view, are just non-combative bugle calls.
Yeah.
And I think they are supposed to really bring the ranks and files of the army closer and instill a higher sense of camaraderie, for example, and really prepare the soldiers and the officers better for their missions that they are supposed to perform. And also, bugle calls can travel at a great distance. You know, it's not only just within the barracks, you know, surrounding areas or civilians can also pick up the bugle call. And I think it also instills a sense of war preparedness.
Not at 5:30 in the morning.
Well, maybe, you know, to get up early physically, it's a healthier habit. But let's put it into a bigger picture. As I mentioned, China plans to modernize its military to become a world-class military by the mid-21st century. And that modernization of the national defense and armed forces should be basically completed by 2035. That's according to President Xi Jinping, who is also chairman of the Central Military Commission. How does the reintroduction of the bugle call system fit into that goal, Victor?
Well, I think the modernization and the improvement of the Chinese military involves many, many things. For example, what we have seen over the past few years is a rapid modernization of the Chinese Navy, Chinese Air Force, and much more improvement of the missile forces, for example. And I think these are all the major things that we can hear about or see about, for example. But as far as the discipline of the soldiers and the officers are concerned, as to their war preparedness, as to their constant alert about what they are supposed to do, big or small things, the introduction of the bugle can serve that purpose.
Okay.
But I would add on that,
briefly,
there's an esprit de corps. It's not just military training. There is got a belief. On the battlefield, you actually fight for the people you are with. So it's very important that you have this sense of community, and that's a lot of this is aimed at.
Okay. Thank you very much to my two guests, Victor Gao, Vice President at the Center for China and Globalization, and Einar Tangen, and Current Affairs commentator. And you have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, China is revamping its military, but how are plans changing as new tensions arise? Stay with me. In a coercive move, the U.S. Air Force recently conducted 2 bomber missions near the South China Sea. The flights came amid a series of contentious issues between Washington and China, including escalating trade tensions, the U.S. sanctioning a Chinese defense entity over its purchase of Russian-made weapons, and accusations that China is interfering in U.S. midterm elections. Meanwhile, China is in the process of ramping up its armed forces into a world-class military by the mid-21st century. Why is China determined to build up its army? How are global issues shaping its vision for its military? And what does that vision mean for China's neighbors and other countries in the world? Earlier, I talked to Zhou Bo, senior colonel from the Chinese Ministry of National Defense. I began by asking him the positioning of the Chinese army in a rapidly changing world. During the New Year address of Chinese President Xi Jinping at the beginning of this year, he said that China firmly supports the authority and the importance of the United Nations, and China will actively fulfill its international responsibilities and duties, and always be a builder of world peace, a contributor of global development, and a keeper of the international order. So under such a overarching requirement, what's the position, what's going to be the role of the Chinese army?
That's a very good question, because for the military, the first priority is always to defend your territory. But for China's military, and as a result of China's development, so we have two more new roles, in my understanding. That is to protect China's ever-growing overseas interest and to shoulder its increasing international responsibility. Because these two really are new in that China's economy overseas, how big is that? Because China's economy is not only in mainland China, it is also overseas. Some people compare it to the size of at least a medium-sized European countries. And besides, great power should greater responsibility. Because China today is the second largest economy in the world, because the PLA is becoming ever stronger, therefore the PLA is asked to do more for the well-being of people in the rest of the world.
So let's talk about what kind of intermediate, maybe also long-term target for development that the PLA is assigned. Let's say we understand that according to the top design, by 2035 the PLA should become modernized, and by 2049, which is mid-21st century, also 100 years after the founding of New China, that it will become a world-class military. Exactly how do you qualify for a world-class military?
That's a very good question, because if you have ever read the white paper book published in 2008, you would find the target of China's PLA becoming modernized was only described to be something achieved by mid-century. That means if we now talk about 2035 to become modernized, basically we would become modernized 15 years in advance. So by the mid-century, 2049 or 2050, it is the target of becoming world-class military.
What kind of requirement, what kind of criteria are we talking about for the PLA to be qualified as a world-class military?
Well, that's a very good question, because people actually haven't talked much about it. We know in the world who is the strongest. But by many people's standard, the PLA is already among the strongest military in the world because of your ever-growing military strength, because of what we have seen in Tiananmen Square, because of the fact that even IISS in London described China's militaries, well, describe the development of PLA hardware since 2000 is more than the combined strength of Japan, South Korea, and India. So the hardware is actually known to all, everybody in the press, but the question is about software, about how capable you are really. And that is a good question in that, because after 1980, essentially, PLA is not involved in any combat at all, even not in any conflict. So how could you prove that you are combat efficient, even with the best equipment? That is a good question asked to PLA, even by China's leadership.
Yeah, according to your understanding, according to China's ability to develop itself so far in an all-round manner, do you think such ambitious goals are realistic, or will it be like what happened to the past in terms of modernization? We can bring the goal closer before the mid-21st century. We can probably already achieve that goal.
I think we can achieve all these objectives in that. Let's talk about the Chinese government. And I believe Chinese government is really among the very few governments in the world who can project an image, a vision, say over 10 years, 20 years, and be able to achieve that. For example, our late chairman Deng Xiaoping said in 1982 that we got to quadruple our agricultural and industrial output by 2000, and we achieved that in 5 years in advance. And then in 2000, we laid down our objectives for 2020. And then we achieved that in 2016, 4 years in advance. So this means Chinese government can really deliver its promise and be able to honor it. And then we talk about some other things. For example, PLA's tradition. PLA is confident about itself in that it believes that we have never lost any wars after liberation. And we came from a very small, weak background, but we lose no war after liberation. And right now there are so many boosters of PLA's development. For example, AI technology. For example, the civil military integration. And China now is the largest industrial nation in the world. So China now has a very strong defense industry. And China's defense industry now virtually can produce almost everything we want.
Well, you talked about China never lost any battle since the founding of New China in 1949. And in fact, China has never engaged itself in any active battle combat since the 1980s. So could it be possible that this kind of confidence you talked about is probably just kind of feeling good about yourself, that you believe you can win, but but these soldiers have never been engaged in any actual battles?
Yeah, that is a good question, because even in PLA Daily we talk about so-called peace disease. That means people have enjoyed peace for so long. So, and unless and until you are really found in a war, how can you prove that you are really capable in fighting? But again, there is a dilemma, because China's rise, even by any standard, is peaceful. And should we just prove ourselves being capable in fighting, therefore we have to have a war? I think that's a question of cost and effectiveness. We should not just to prove ourselves or even train ourselves to have a war. But at the same time, even in peacetime, you can do training, and this is what we are doing exactly. Now you see more and more 3 service joint training, especially of the first chain of Ireland, and you have also seen increasing number of PLA joint exercises, especially with countries within Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and in particular with Russia. All these would definitely boost the combat effectiveness.
Let's talk a little bit of the financial support to the military from the central government. We know China's military spending is about 1.5% of the GDP. Some people say this is a lot, but really in terms of the percentage of the military spending to the GDP, China is really actually very low. But how can you maintain or sustain the long-term growth of the PLA with such a low percentage of spending?
Right, even if the expenditure is low, but it is sustainable, because over decades we have been invested like this. So because your whole economy is growing, therefore even 1.5% now is different from 1.5 20 years ago. And because of this, it's sustainable but low defense expenditure, so we are what we are today. And if you just compare China's GDP, for example, with NATO, because everybody now knows how Trump actually lambasted NATO to spend 2% by 2024. NATO standard is even higher than China. But then we have to compare one thing about your perception of threat, right? Because China's 1.5% GDP spending on defense just indicate that we do not really take anybody as a serious threat.
Well, at this moment, as you mentioned, U.S. President Donald Trump is demanding that the NATO spend more, and actually after the meeting, after his trip to Brussels, it seems that he has got something in return. He said that NATO members have added $41 billion extra for defense spending, and that the NATO will be taking additional $33 billion or more, and at least 17 NATO members have pledged to reach the target of spending 2% of GDP on their defense by 2024. Does that give additional pressure for China to up the ante by, matching that number in the near future?
I don't think so. First of all, China and NATO are not at loggerheads. Actually, China and NATO have a reasonable, good working relationship. I myself have been in charge of this for some time, because we even have maintained contact at a certain level, and we have exchanges, be it delegation visits or exchange of scholars. So we're just talking about a different perspective, because China's low defense expenditure indicate in one way that we do not believe that we have serious threat. And there is a good point. Why just 5 countries of NATO spend more than 2%? That means most of them do not consider they really have a serious threat. If you are in serious threat, of course you would have to spend more, but the majority, out of 29 countries, only 5 can spend more than 2%. That is self-evident.
Well, again, it seems to me there's a dilemma there, right? We do not feel threatened so that we don't spend that much. But look, the United States is putting China as its primary strategic competitor, and actually, as we all know, President Trump has tilted the majority of his military resources in the theater of Asia-Pacific, right, under this Indo-Pacific policy. For instance, it is believed that 60% of American overseas tactical aviation assets will be assigned to the Asia-Pacific in the very near future. So what is China going to do? Do we, do we perceive more security concerns then?
That is a very good question. Well, the fact that the United States has, for the first time, taken China as a primary competitor doesn't mean that necessarily that we will take them as enemy. Because we believe, first of all, they are not reasonable in taking China as the top strategic competitor, because the reasons as laid down in the defense report is really ridiculous, in that it argues that China, by using predatory economics, actually threatened its neighbors. But the point is, China is best trading partners with 130 countries, including the United States. So how can you threaten 130 countries into your best trading partner? This is what I have written, in my opinion, published in Financial Times. So this is not logical. And I don't believe at all that China should be taken as such a strategic competitor. This is wrong.
Zhou Bo, Senior Colonel from the Chinese Ministry of National Defense. And that's it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.